the early 19th century, a minister from Boston named Greeley was invited to preach the ordination sermon of a new minister in Baltimore. His sermon about the possibility of a Unitarian Christianity became famous. It was usually thought of as the real beginning of the Unitarian Association. And the sermon was called the Baltimore Sermon. In 1973, my good friend and colleague, Larry McGinty, invited me to preach the installation sermon to begin his ministry at the First Unitarian Church in Cincinnati. And I asked Larry, is there anything particular you want me to hit or say? And he said, no, all I want is that from this time on, this will be known as the Cincinnati Sermon. So I said, well, that's fine, but that makes me the Greeley and you, Jared, the Baltimore minister. And Larry said, well, that's fine. He went on to become the president of Harvard. So I preached, and here it is for you, the Cincinnati Sermon. Before I start, I do want to pass on to you a story of the man who, with his wife, went to the theater. And as they were getting in to their seats, he was rather a big man and heavy, and he stepped on the foot of the man at the beginning of the row. After the intermission, when they were coming back to their seats, he said to the man, "Did I step on your foot when we came in?" "Yes," said the man, rather grimly, thinking then there would be an apology. But the big man said, "It's okay, Mary, this is the row." In the summer of 1793, a young Irishman named Arthur Wesley burned his violin. He did it with his own hands. As a boy, he had sat enraptured while his father played the violin. And as an older boy, he had learned to play for himself. And indeed, music seemed to be his outstanding talent. Making music was one of the things he still enjoyed at the age of 25 when he burned his violin. In 1798, the family name was changed from Wesley back to Wellesley, as it had been for several hundred years. In 1809, he became Viscount Wellington, and in 1815, he defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. He became the Duke of Wellington, the most influential and respected Briton of his time, until his death in 1853. He was a younger son in a family with a great history and great dreams, but insufficient present resources. He went to Eton for a while, but was withdrawn by his family to make way for a promising brother. He was 16 when his mother wrote, "I'll vow to God I don't know what I shall do with my awkward son, Arthur. He is food for powder and nothing more." That would seem to be a rather detached maternal view. The army was seen as the last refuge for square pegs, and Arthur joined a Highland regiment on his 18th birthday. In the next few years, he returned to Ireland and led the life of a young officer, playing cards, at certain clubs being entertained in the great houses. He proposed marriage to a young lady and was turned down. He was a bit of a dilettante, but something coalesced within him in 1793 and caused him suddenly to leave behind the card playing in the Dublin clubs, the parties and the dances, the long walks and the poetry of his life, and he burned his violin. We can only speculate why. He was to devote himself hereafter to regimental accounts and a single-minded concentration on his military career. Perhaps the violin was too soft and seductive a pastime. Perhaps it seemed not virile enough in that long-gone time for a soldier. Perhaps it opened his imagination too easily to fancies which must be guarded against, closed out. Perhaps it made him vulnerable. There are so many ways of feeling vulnerable. And to feel vulnerable is to be vulnerable. From the small child's terror of being abandoned to the high school student who is not very quick and who sits for years through certain classes in abject terror that he may be called on any minute, made to feel a fool. There is vulnerability. All around us, there are tests to be passed, suggested tests that the culture makes optional, but that we impose on ourselves as requirements. Am I presentable? Am I masculine enough or feminine enough? Can I make the team? Can I get dates? Can I have a happy marriage? Can I make some money? Can I get elected to something? Am I liberal enough? Committed enough? Healthy? Can I keep this marriage going? Do I look as old as I am? Can I live forever? Can I face an operation? Can I have a few more years? Can I die? I mean, do it right, with some dignity left. I think that every person who joins a church is acknowledging vulnerability. If that belief is true, and some would debate it, then it diagrams the greatest danger that the churches face, and also their single greatest strength, all because we handle our vulnerabilities so variously. Wellington burned his violin. Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy both concealed the extent of their physical handicaps early in their political careers, knowing that the voting public must have an unqualified confidence in their strength before it would entrust high office to them. Later, the vulnerability would become part of their appeal, once we knew how strong they were, but it must never define them. Too frequently, physical handicaps are the most graphic. Abby Donovan is a woman who's been crippled for 25 years. And she wrote, "I've been assuming that I was necessarily inferior as a human being, and that any benevolences received were such as I had no right to expect. I have acted as the world wanted me to act, as a cripple. Now I'm sick of being a supplicant. It's my struggle, even as it is your human responsibility, if you care, not to define my fears, hopes, successes, and failures by my cane, my crutches, my braces. It is my struggle, in any case, to keep alive in myself the knowledge that I'm a full-fledged human being, in spite of society's embarrassment, distaste, fear, ignorance, and misconception, not to mention its ability not even to see me. Becoming visible, asking you to see me as a person, not a cripple, is very risky indeed. But I freely choose it now, says Abby Donovan, as she risks a new kind of vulnerability for a new kind of living. Some kinds of vulnerability are merely well-established nonsense. In 1861, Elizabeth Garrett was excluded from the program of medical studies at Middlesex Hospital in London by a petition signed by 43 of her fellow students, complaining that the appearance of young females as passive spectators — there were already nurses in the operating rooms — in the operating centers is an outrage on our natural feelings and is calculated to destroy those sentiments of respect and admiration with which the opposite sex is regarded by all right-minded men. Elizabeth Garrett overcome that particular vulnerability and went on to become England's first woman doctor. But we still have a great deal of well-established nonsense prevailing about women, what women ought to be allowed to do, and what black people ought to be allowed to do, and homosexual people, and crippled people, and poor people, and people who are not emotionally stable. The list could go on, of lives establishing a personhood in spite of, laying scar tissue over the vulnerabilities until we discover, if we are lucky, that that is not what being a person is about. It was all a mistake. Our real lives are elsewhere. But these vulnerabilities can get to be a habit. We should not be left to fight the well-established nonsense alone. This is a superb function for a church, to be a quiet stronghold of human sense in the sea of well-established nonsense. Some people believe that a church can do this if it would only practice what it preaches. But I am inclined to think that a church does it more strikingly by the way it treats the people who are vulnerable because they are in difficulty with what the church stands for. One should not have to be made an example of to show that the church is pure and righteous. I remember a young lady saying to me, "It seemed a little funny in church last Sunday. There we all were, practically in the same row. The man I'm living with, and his wife, and my husband, and her lawyer. I thought that church was probably doing something right." Perhaps you remember that I said that joining a church was an acknowledgement of vulnerability. I wanted that to nag you a bit before I dealt with it. There are so many kinds of vulnerability. Other people's and our own stereotypes, our weakness, dependence, anxiety, innocence, and naivete. Joining a church seems to be equivalent to saying, life and death together are more than I can deal with alone. People who have closed off their vulnerabilities, like Wellington burning his violin. People whose life force must be channeled to some great, and like Marie Curie or Arturo Toscanini, these people seldom have time for a church, which might threaten their invulnerability. I say that not as a moral judgment, but as a simple observation. They have a different way of coping. But some of us come to a church seeking greater strength in our weakness. Jung says, there appears to be a conscience in mankind which severely punishes the person who does not somehow and at some time, at whatever cost to his pride, cease to defend and assert himself, and instead confesses himself fallible and human. Until we can do this, we are really cut off from humanity. And it's pretty cold and lonely out there among the saints. However various are the links in our armor, and however much each of us may cherish the uniqueness of his own Achilles heel, there are two kinds of vulnerability that none of us escapes: mortality and morality. The awareness that we will not live forever and that we will lose people whom we love should be the beginning of religion. Our mandate to make each day count. The church is the only institution I know of which has the power to help us put those things together, facing loss and dying, and living as though our days were few. The other agencies of the society do not have so much to offer to this anxiety. But when it comes to morality, the church has all sorts of competition. In education, it is called moral and spiritual values. And when I was a high school teacher, we were supposed to pump them into all our courses. The news media have the upper hand in moralizing over the politicians at the moment, but we are in the middle of a presidential election. We're going to hear a great deal of moralizing from the candidates. But this is not how you and I learned most of what we know about morality. Not from the great golden voices of the truth and the right, or even of the way and the light. We learned it from the people we encountered when we were most vulnerable, when we were weak or lonely or guilty or scared. Some of us held us and still hold us in their love. We don't have to deserve them. They are simply there. And others were cold and demanding and made us measure up in ways we never knew we could, and so made us stronger, less vulnerable. And then there were those, like the students and the faculty in high school, where one lonely girl was the first black student. She was a senior, and she was stoic throughout the ordeal of that year. And then the yearbook came out, and under her picture she read, "You pays your money and you takes your choice." And then she could be stoic no more. Sometimes when we are most vulnerable, we get kicked in the teeth. We all know people to whom vulnerability always seems an invitation to aggression. Now, these are the lessons we received in morality. But what we learned is some combination of this love must be shared, how much like me. That must never happen again. No one should go through that. And I'll get even somehow. Or I passed the test, they have to pass it the same way. The combination gets learned imperfectly. And we move along through new strengths and new exposed and tender times to find ourselves both better people than we thought we could be and not as good as we thought we had to be. If we are lucky, we are open to some people who keep us fooling ourselves too much. We are vulnerable to them. So, vulnerable and aspiring, we come together as a church, and at some isolated moment, we feel the twinge, or we face the brute fact that this is a church, and the whole thing looks and acts so strong and true and right. And what am I doing here? When we all come together looking so strong and true and right and mentally healthy. So I'm okay, you're okay. And we sit in these chairs and sing these hymns. We seem so invulnerable. I get scared to death because I know I'm not put together that well. And if you are, then you don't have much to offer me. If you're too good, then I don't belong here. I'd rather be a sinner in the hands of an angry God than a sinner in the congregation of the over-righteous. It all comes down to a puzzle. We join the church because we are vulnerable. And the church should help us to turn some of that vulnerability into strength. But it can only do that if it remains vulnerable, fragile, compromised, and strong enough not to have to always be right. And we can only be good for each other if we keep some of that vulnerability. Suppose Arthur Wesley hadn't burned his violin. Would he have become the great general? Would Napoleon have emerged the victor at Waterloo? Would our whole history have been changed? Would we be speaking French? I don't know. Maybe he had to do that. But to you, my friend, and all my friends, I beg of you, don't put the match to that violin. I'll probably need your music more than your strategy. And sometimes we need each other to be strong. But we always need each other to be vulnerable. End.